Operation Desert Storm. You know, for a lot of us, the name brings up these really specific images, right? Stealth fighters, smart bombs, all playing out live on TV. It was billed as this brand new kind of war, a video game war, that was supposed to prove once and for all the power of air strategy. But what if that whole story, the one we all remember, is only half the picture? Okay, let's get into it. So back in early 1991, President George H.W. Bush laid it all out with these words. This wasn't just going to be another military operation. Nope. This was meant to be a show of overwhelming, absolutely decisive force. The whole world was expecting this technological storm that would just sweep the Iraqi army off the map and prove America had a new way of fighting wars. And that, right there, is the big question we're going to tackle. The popular version of Desert Storm is this flawless victory, a showcase of technological genius. But, you know, when you start digging into the declassified reports and the deep analysis that came out after the war, you get a much more complicated and honestly a way more interesting story about what really went down in the skies over Iraq. So to get to the bottom of it all, we're going to walk through the whole thing, from start to finish. We'll look at the invasion that kicked it all off, that game-changing air strategy, the famous ground war, and then we're going to pivot. We'll dive into the critical post-war analysis that pretty much challenged everything we thought we knew. And finally, we'll talk about the real lessons learned. So how in the world did this all start? Well, on August 2nd, 1990, the world just watched, stunned, as Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army rolled into their tiny, oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. But this wasn't some random act. It was really the boiling point of tensions that had been simmering for a long, long time. See, the 8-year war with Iran had totally wrecked Iraq's economy. Saddam Hussein was buried under this mountain of debt, including about $37 billion he owed to Gulf states like Kuwait. He basically argued that these loans should be forgiven, saying, hey, I was protecting you from Iran. When Kuwait said no, things escalated fast. That led to the invasion, which was immediately followed by tough UN sanctions. From Saddam's point of view, he had his reasons. These huge debts, old arguments over who owned what territory, and he even accused Kuwait of messing with oil prices. But to the rest of the world, it looked like a straight-up act of aggression, plain and simple. The international backlash was almost universal, and it led to this massive 34-nation coalition, all led by the US, demanding that Iraq get out of Kuwait immediately. Iraq refused to budge, so the coalition got ready for war. But the plan they came up with, it was revolutionary. It was built on this new idea that put air power first, like never before. The goal was to basically dismantle Iraq's entire ability to fight before a single ground troop even set foot across the border. So here's the key idea, and this is really crucial. The plan was to make the ground war almost an afterthought. The strategy was to use air power to first get total control of the skies. Then you systematically take apart every single piece of Iraq's war machine. Their command centers, missile sites, air force, supply lines, you name it. You do that until their army in Kuwait is totally isolated, deaf, blind, and just waiting to surrender. And then, on January 17, 1991, the storm was unleashed. For 43 straight days, the world was glued to their TVs, watching what looked like a perfect, high-tech air assault. Night after night, we saw that grainy green footage of laser-guided bombs hitting their targets with what seemed like impossible precision. I mean, the sheer scale of it was just immense. U.S. planes alone flew around 40,000 combat missions against ground targets. To put that into perspective for you, the amount of bombs dropped per day by the U.S. was equal to 85% of the daily average dropped on Germany and Japan during all of World War II. It was just a relentless, nonstop assault. And the targeting was incredibly thorough. Now, what's really interesting here is you can see the strategy in action. The coalition wasn't just hitting tanks. They were systematically going after these key strategic targets to tear down the entire Iraqi state. They hit everything from Command Controlling Communication, or C3, to Scud missile launchers and the elite Republican Guard. The goal was nothing less than total systemic collapse. So, after 43 days of this absolute aerial pounding, the Iraqi military was, well, it was reeling. It was time for the ground war. But instead of just a bloody head-on charge into Kuwait's defenses, the coalition commander, General Norman Schwarzkopf, had planned one of the boldest moves in modern military history. He actually called it the Hail Mary. The whole idea was to trick Saddam into thinking the main attack would come straight up from the south, right into Kuwait. But the real punch was this massive left hook. Over 200,000 troops and all their gear secretly moved way out west to swing deep into Iraq and cut off the Iraqi army from behind. And the execution was just brilliant. It happened in 4 key steps. First, you deceive them, make them look south. Second, you pull off that huge flanking move. Schwarzkopf himself called it an extraordinary move. Third, you attack, slicing deep into Iraq to trap the enemy. And finally, you liberate Kuwait as that trapped Iraqi army just completely falls apart. And the result? A stunning success. In just 100 hours, that's just 4 days, the ground war was over. The images of surrendering Iraqi soldiers and the famous Highway of Death seemed to seal the deal. This was a swift, decisive, and incredible victory. The myth of the perfect war was now complete. But then, years later, a completely different story started to come out. In 1996, the U.S. General Accounting Office, the GAO, which is a nonpartisan government watchdog, released this huge report on the air war. And its findings? Well, they didn't just tweak the story. They completely challenged this idea of a flawless, high-tech win. And remember, this wasn't some outside critic. This was the government grading its own homework. And this quote from the report is the bombshell. The GAO basically concluded that a lot of the public claims about how well the weapons worked, the stealth fighters, the laser-guided bombs were, and I'm quoting here, overstated, misleading, or unverifiable. This was a huge rebuke of the whole idea that technology had somehow created a clean, perfect war. This chart right here does a fantastic job of showing one of their key findings. We all remember the smart bombs, right? Well, they only made up 8% of the total tonnage of bombs dropped. But get this, they accounted for a staggering 84% of the total cost of all munitions. This huge cost difference made people ask some really serious questions about how efficient they really were. So the myth was one target, one bomb, this idea of surgical precision. But the GAO's data showed something totally different. To successfully take out a single strategic target, it took, on average, over 11 tons of guided bombs and 44 tons of unguided ones. So much for surgical strikes. The reality wasn't precision. It was overwhelming brute force, using a ton of both smart and dumb bombs to get the job done. So why the huge discrepancy? Well, the GAO found that all this high-tech gear had some serious real-world problems. Those advanced sensors, they were seriously hampered by things like clouds, smoke, even just humidity. Pilots flying high up often couldn't tell what they were looking at. Was that a tank or a bus? Was it already blown up? On top of that, there were major failures in intelligence and damage assessment, which meant planes were often sent back to hit targets that were already destroyed, just wasting time, fuel, and bombs. So if it wasn't a perfect high-tech victory, then what was it? What are the real lessons we should take away from Operation Desert Storm? Not based on the myth, but on this much deeper, more critical look at its air power strategy. Well, the first big lesson is that the win didn't come from just a few miracle weapons. The GAO concluded the victory came from the sheer variety and volume of the coalition's firepower. It was the combination of everything: the heavy B-52s dropping tons of unguided bombs, the stealth fighters delivering smart bombs, and ground attack jets like the A-10 flying a crazy number of missions. All of it together just completely overwhelmed the Iraqis. It was a victory of systems, not just of a single technology. And the second lesson, which is maybe even more important, is about the limits of technology itself. Desert Storm was a really powerful reminder that war is not a video game. Even the most advanced sensors and the smartest bombs are still held back by very real things: bad weather, bad intelligence, and that simple, chaotic confusion that military planners call the fog of war. The air power strategy worked, but not because the tools were perfect. It worked because the coalition used them with overwhelming, relentless force. And all of this brings us to one final big question to think about. That myth of the perfect war in 1991 was incredibly powerful. So, did that perception of a clean, easy, high-tech victory create dangerously unrealistic expectations for the much harder, much longer conflicts that were to come, especially the invasion of Iraq just a decade later? It's a question that makes you realize that the stories we tell ourselves about our wars can be just as important as the wars themselves.